The Russian army, the professional Russian army, is gone. It was destroyed in the first year of this war. And a lot of Putin's much vaunted technology has hypersonic missiles that were apparently unstoppable. Well, even with the current air defense that Ukrainians have, they're all being shot down. Now, conversely, you then look at the Americans and their operation to attack deep underground the Iranian nuclear program. Now, that was defended by Russian air defense, by Russian fighters. And all the American jets and missiles got through, completely unharmed and got back again. And I think that sent a real message. I think the Kremlin knew it anyway, but everybody else should be realizing actually, when it comes to military technology, the US in particular is way out in front, and Russia is some way behind.
Hello and welcome to the Putin Files for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Hamish De Bretton Gordon, former commander of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological and Nuclear Regiment, military commentator and very much a friend of the show. Hamish, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hamish, Donald Trump has announced the US has repositioned 2 nuclear submarines on Sunday, which followed comments by former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev calling US ultimatums, one of which is almost upon us now. He called those ultimatums a step towards war. What should we make of this situation, and how crucial is it that those submarines have been moved?
Well, I think there's an awful lot to unpick here. This week is a very significant week. I suppose, we're virtually always saying that, but this week in particular, especially when we focus on the nuclear piece, the fact that President Trump has allegedly repositioned 2 US nuclear submarines close to Russia, really from a strategic or tactical point of view, means very little. The Americans always have an at-sea deterrent. They always have subs out there ready to use. That's what the deterrent's about. And so does Britain. Britain always has one submarine with Trident nuclear missiles ready to go at any one time. So this is very much more, I think, posturing and manoeuvring. Trump knows that this week, or he has set this week up to be so crucial. And Dmitry Medvedev, we've got to know pretty well as well over the last few years, was Prime Minister of Russia some time ago. Bit of a loose cannon, has a real reputation for firing off the hip. Particularly when he's had a few vodkas. I think the view is that his position in the Kremlin now is, he's a bit of a bit player, but he does seem to feed the narrative. And when it comes to the nuclear piece, Medvedev and Peskov, who's the actual official Kremlin spokesman, have been using the nuclear piece, very often in the last 3.5 years of Putin's special military operation. Presentationally, I think, to cow, perhaps originally timid European leaders, and also originally when Trump seemed to pull back from NATO to gain some sort of traction. However, at the moment, the rhetoric is really behind, I think, the fact that Trump's 10 days of route to the peace negotiation table he gave President Putin just 9 days ago is sort of running out tomorrow. It's also a very symbolic historical time. It was 80 years ago tomorrow that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, killed 50% of those residents there instantaneously. And then 3 days later, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And, in a trice, that was the end of the Second World War. So the sensitivity around the nuclear piece and the sensitivity around the war in Ukraine, I think, is not quite on a knife edge, but the chances of misunderstanding, misjudgment, and mistrust are incredibly high. So I think we have to look at all these things in some detail and take them for what they are. I don't think President Trump is threatening to nuke the Kremlin, as it were. I think he is threatening to really raise the stakes and making sure that Putin and the fellows in the Kremlin, like Peskov, realize that Trump is serious now, really serious about peace, and Putin needs to react this week. Otherwise, no doubt Trump will follow through with those sanctions and tariffs.
And yet we should, of course, mention that we are recording this Tuesday evening, UK time, on the 5th of August. Russia's response to Trump yesterday was seemingly to announce that it'll no longer abide by the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, Donald Trump himself had actually pulled the US out of that treaty in 2019. But how worried should we be of this kind of final death knell in that agreement on shorter range nuclear missiles?
Well, again, I think this is part of the narrative that's playing out at the moment. I think the whole nuclear piece really, since the end of the Cold War, most countries sort of paid lip service to what was happening as far as nuclear weapons were concerned. And we are really now paying for that. Now, the various treaties like the START Treaty, the Short Range Treaty you're talking about, have all sort of fallen into unuse, as it were, for want of a better word. Now, does it really make a difference? Well, again, I think it is just part of the rhetoric, part of building up the position for negotiation, because, as you say, Trump has paid lip service to this particular treaty, as he has to many of the others. I think on a wider perspective, what is of greater concern since the end of the Cold War is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Now, it was only last month we were discussing Iran's nuclear program and the fact that President Trump ordered the surgical strike to severely damage, it would appear to be, Iran's nuclear program. At the same time, we're aware that the North Koreans are pretty close to being able to put a warhead on the end of a missile, a nuclear warhead, and have a capability there as well. So the whole rhetoric around nuclear has just ramped up and up and up and up. And we seem to have a lot of sort of really difficult issues at the moment that seem completely unsolvable through conventional means. And the nuclear rhetoric, it seems to very easily pour off the lips of leaders in the Kremlin and the White House and elsewhere at the moment. The final bit, this, Louis, that we must consider as well is the Chinese. We've only seen this week the Chinese and Russian fleets exercising in the South China Seas and the Pacific. And we know that China actually is building more nuclear warheads than anybody else. It is way behind the Americans. The Americans and Russians both have about 5,000 warheads each. The Chinese are only at the sort of 500 mark, but increasing. So I think it is an area that one, I don't want to sound glib about it, because, as I said at the beginning, one mistake can lead to absolute disaster. And when you have two people like Trump and Putin with their hands sort of hovering above the red button, as it were, now, I personally think, they are both pretty rational, but do they have the moral integrity as well to make sure that they do the right thing? And they're both fairly elderly gentlemen. And, if it wasn't for the fact that both Putin and Trump are so concerned about their legacy, then we might be even more worried. But the stakes are high at the moment. And it is very important that world leaders around the globe don't react too quickly to each verbiage that comes out of the Kremlin or the White House, and take them for what they are. And hopefully what they will lead to is negotiation, not necessarily with any treaty that's been preordained, but probably face-to-face with the world leaders who actually can move the dial, rather than people sort of shouting on the sidelines who are an irritating irrelevance.
And if international agreements like the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty you mentioned, and of course the INF we mentioned before, aren't what control and sort of lead over the top of decisions these militaries make, what is it that's now guiding nuclear doctrines, do you think? I mean, we've seen that, while Russia has in its doctrine, for example, the use of tactical nuclear missiles, there doesn't seem to be currently a very realistic threat of those weapons being used imminently. Where do we think the decision making is coming from at the moment on Russia's use and threat of use on nuclear weapons?
Well, I think that the whole nuclear piece and its doctrine is there to try and influence the debate and influence people. And Russia is frequently changing its doctrine, and in fact, only changed it very recently, in theory, to allow it to use a battlefield nuclear weapon if its territory was invaded. And we were all concerned last year that when Ukraine had a fairly major incursion into the Kursk region, part of Western Russia, that might have precipitated use. But actually, again, the lines coming out of the Kremlin were more to force Ukraine to come back than a serious use of these weapons. So doctrine, in a way, I think it is more to use as a stick to beat your opponent rather than actually use it. I think people should be reassured that these weapons have kept the peace for the last 80 years. And the idea of mutually assured destruction is something that still sort of resonates around the peace. But I think, unfortunately, the more people talk about it, and the more people get involved, and the more people get backed into a corner, that is where this idea of misunderstanding, misjudgment, or mistake comes in here. And, conventional weapons, you can have a misunderstanding, mistake, or misjudgment, and sure, people might get hurt or killed. But it's slightly different when you've got a weapon. And looking back to Hiroshima 80 years ago, one weapon killing 40-odd thousand people, and subsequently a lot more, really shows the power of these things to have an unbelievable impact. So again, that is why doctrine is important. So are these treaties, but absolutely having cool heads, not only of the leaders, but as important, the people who are advising and directing them too. And I suppose people do get concerned when people like Medvedev are firing off at the hip, but actually, I think the informed view is that somebody like Medvedev doesn't have a lot of influence in the Kremlin these days.
And what role do some of the almost third parties in the conflict in Europe at the moment play? I mean, for example, nations like China, how important do you judge their role in keeping heads cooler, especially in Russia, over nuclear rhetoric?
Well, it would appear that the Chinese have a lot of influence over the Russians these days. The Russians are really short of allies. When you have to rely on North Korea for your ammunition and buying soldiers off them, it shows what a pretty poor position you're in. And when your allies like the Iranians have stopped feeding you with drones and missiles because they need them themselves, or they've been destroyed by the Americans and the Israelis, the Chinese are an obvious ally to Russia, and Russia really wants to make sure that they're on side. So I think China is very important. But I suppose what the solace we must get in the West is that although China is a communist country, which would appear to be the opposite end of the spectrum of the West, and particularly the United States, Chinese communism is based on development of their economy, and that's where they think their power comes from. And they know that most of their economy is run by actually the American economy. That's where they get most of their hard currency. That's where they sell most of their kit. So it would be pretty incongruous for China to try and face up against the United States. And we just go back to the nuclear issue. The United States has 5,000 warheads. Chinese probably have 500. So there is an imbalance there. But I think China has a really important role to play because it does sit on the fence in a sort of geopolitical sort of way, and it might well be that it is a government that Putin will listen to, and would not want to get completely isolated from the Chinese. So I would hope there is dialogue going on between the West and the Chinese, behind closed doors, to make sure that all this nuclear hubris and filibuster at the moment doesn't turn into something that could really damage the planet.
And you did mention before, Hamish, about the build-up of China's nuclear weapons. How worried should we be about nuclear proliferation among some of Russia's other allies, like North Korea that you mentioned before, and Iran?
Yeah, I think we should be really worried about proliferation, and particularly those two countries, Iran and North Korea. Both of them have autocratic, almost tyrannical leaderships, and these are not the sort of people that we trust. North Korea might only have a couple of warheads, but that is all you need. One nuclear missile fired at Japan could trigger a much wider conflict, and that is the sort of thing that the North Korean leader Kim Jong Un is sort of threatening to do. In a similar fashion, Iran. The Iran-Israel conflict is long and deep, and both of those countries would see the obliteration of the other. Now, it would appear that the Israelis do have a nuclear weapon, and it would appear that if they were confronted by an Iranian nuclear weapon, that would create a sort of nuclear conflict. So, yeah, I think having those countries is really dangerous. Let's not forget, of course, that the Indians and the Pakistanis also have nuclear capabilities and are in a virtual state of war. Thankfully, nothing has escalated to this level. And I think that, the one solace people should take is that over 80 years, these weapons haven't been fired again like they were in Japan at the end of the Second World War, because people realize the enormity of it. I think unlike Japan, unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was a one-way nuclear exchange, I think any exchange now would not be one way. It would definitely be two-way. And a two-way exchange is really bad for the planet. And I think people realize that. And I think, whatever hubris and hyperbole we get out of the White House and the Kremlin and perhaps Beijing and North Korea, there are still, it is not a straightforward sort of action of pressing the so-called red button. This can't happen on a whim. And, I understand, the checks and balances are in place to make sure that what I've talked about, the mistake, misunderstanding and misjudgments, there will always be a second check to that. So with all that being said, although, the threats are pretty high at the moment, higher than probably they've ever been since the end of the Second World War, it's still not, it is not a foregone conclusion, as some people suggest, that we're on the edge of some sort of nuclear exchange.
Yes, and as you say, Hamish, the most impactful use of nuclear weapons since, after the end of World War II has been rhetorical. So how do you judge Putin's use of nuclear threats, that rhetoric of threatening nuclear weapons to curb the West's response to, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and a growing aggression and military buildup by Russia?
Well, I think in the early days after the invasion of Ukraine, after 24th February 2022, actually, I think Putin's nuclear threats and, Peskov and others were pretty effective. And he was very much focused on European leaders, European NATO countries, because he knew that the conventional strength of NATO countries in Europe far outmatches the Russians. And the last thing that Putin wanted was for the Germans and the Italians and the Greeks and the French to flood military capability into Ukraine. So I think in the early days, those threats of tactical nuclear strikes were very much aimed at those capitals, particularly some of the ones with rather weaker governments. And that really held them back. And I think that held back a lot of support to Ukraine, which is probably why we are where we are. having said that, as time went on, I think people then began to realize that actually, all these threats coming out of the Kremlin were completely hollow. And I think people realized that, there was no way that Russia was going to fire some sort of missile or bomb from a bomber with a nuclear tip to it, because of the reaction what would happen. But then we had issues with the new president of the US, President Trump, stepping back, giving a little bit more flexibility to the Russians. But I think now people realize actually that it was just pure hubris, and people are now not reacting as such. Of course, this week is a very tense week, but I don't, despite the fact that President Trump's allegedly moved a few submarines around, I don't think that's put the likelihood of any nuclear exchange any closer. I think it's part of the juggling that goes on before, no doubt, President Trump gets into his deal making mode, hopefully, this week, to ensure that Putin comes to the negotiation table. And the most important thing, of course, of all of this is that Ukraine gets a just peace.
And in that vein, how important have Russia's nuclear weapons and their capability to produce new weapons like hypersonic missiles become quite crucial to Putin's leadership of Russia and its sort of identity or its attempt to maintain status as a military superpower?
Well, I think on the one hand, that is exactly what President Putin and the people in the Kremlin are trying to do, is project this, powerful military, developing new kit, hypersonic missiles, etc., etc., etc. However, the reality is very far from that, and people need to realize that. I mean, the Russian military, the Russian army, the professional Russian army is gone. It was destroyed in the first year of this war. And a lot of Putin's much vaunted technology has hypersonic missiles that were apparently unstoppable. Well, even with the current air defense that Ukrainians have, they're all being shot down. Now, conversely, you then look at the Americans and their operation to attack deep underground the Iranian nuclear program. Now, that was defended by Russian air defense, by Russian fighters. And all the American jets and missiles got through, completely unharmed and got back again. And I think that sent a real message. Well, I think the Kremlin knew it anyway, but everybody else should be realizing actually, when it comes to military technology, the US in particular is way out in front, and Russia is some way behind. So people should see it for what it is. Putin and his like talk a very good game, but actually, an army that's lost 1 million people, an army that's lost anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 tanks, ain't at the top of technology. Whereas you look at the Americans, who can conduct an operation over half the distance of the planet, bomb some impenetrable sites in Iran, and get in and out without even a scratch. It just shows you the difference in capability, which is why, the Americans, if they flex even just their conventional military muscle, that should be enough to get the Russians to negotiate and get a just peace for Ukraine.
Well, exactly. And of course, none of this is to say that Russia's nuclear capability can't represent an existential threat. But given the wider deterioration of the Russian military, it's notable the state that Russia's nuclear capabilities will be in. I mean, you've been writing about recent damage from the Kamchatka Peninsula earthquake tsunami on some of Russia's nuclear capabilities as well, haven't you?
Well, absolutely. I think they're two really important events to look at. A couple of months ago, we discussed Operation Spider's Web, which was the Ukrainian security service operation deep into Russia, which destroyed over a third of the Russian strategic nuclear bombers. Yeah, these are the long-range jets that carry the Russian tactical nuclear weapons. And to lose a third of those is hugely significant. And we understand the Russians have moved the rest. out of range of Ukraine in particular, and probably out of range of Europe too. The second event was the tsunami last week. Now, we know that the port, the Russian military port, which houses a lot of the Russian nuclear submarines and more importantly, the submarines that carry their ballistic nuclear weapons, are housed there. Now, on the surface, there's some damage, but this was a port, and no doubt a lot of the submarines are housed in pens below the surface. That's the way these things are done. But this port was just 75 miles from, I think it's the 8th largest earthquake ever recorded on Earth. And when we see, you just look at the damage to the Fukushima nuclear plant from a tsunami, an earthquake much, much smaller than the one we saw last week, and originating much, much further away from Japan, you can see the destructive power. So there is a lot of talk that some of those submarines, have been damaged, or certainly the port has made it difficult for them to use. So on that basis, of course, it's a fair assumption that some of Russia's nuclear capability has been damaged. It's also a fair assumption, and it has been reported before, that actually some of its sort of ground-based nuclear missiles and others are in a pretty poor state of repair, and it's unlikely that Russia has been investing an awful lot of money in upgrading them and keeping them up to speed. Having said all that, Russia has so much nuclear capability that even if some of it is unusable, that what is still usable could still decimate anything that's in its way. So I think we absolutely can't discount it. But psychologically, hopefully, Trump realizes that Putin is on the back foot here, and will be more confident in negotiating with him this week and persuading him to come to a peace deal over Ukraine.
Well, Hamish De Bretton Gordon, former commander of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological and Nuclear Regiment, thank you very much for speaking with me today on the Putin Files.
Thank you very much for having me.